part of the resilience, a major component of the resilience, is a national security component and considerations around that. Our office now, the Office of Electricity, the Department of Energy, is really starting to take a look at resilience and the national security side of that. And resilience is a very large, as Paul was talking about, resilience starts to get into issues which are very large, which encompass a lot of different decision makers, especially policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels. And so one of the questions that we really have to address and incorporate so that we have more integrated planning processes is, what are the respective roles of the local, state, and federal decision makers, and how should they actually coordinate to be able to institute really effective planning processes that lead to prudent and effective investments in the grid. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with this slide, I'm really trying to provide sort of a short list of what the national security concerns are. Obviously, there are many of them, including what we're facing right now with the coronavirus, et cetera. But with regard to the energy infrastructure, I've tried to shorten this list down to basically 3 different areas. One has to do with protecting critical infrastructure, both civilian and defense critical infrastructure, from all hazards, weather hazards, et cetera. And we can compartmentalize the kind of capabilities we need to evolve to be able to effectively protect this critical infrastructure into basically 4 main components. And they're associated with what we do before a disaster happens and after a disaster happens. The components are, first, mitigation. And what mitigation is, efforts surrounding mitigation are really structural and non-structural efforts to really reduce risk. And they often are tied to key investments. Another component in the pre-disaster capability category is emergency preparedness. And that's ensuring that our emergency response capabilities are really robust and well coordinated. In the post-disaster side of the equation, we're really looking at our ability to respond effectively when emergencies do happen, but also to recover, i.e. bring the grid or the energy system back to its an appropriate functioning level. And so around this, we're going to focus in on defense critical energy infrastructure. But I wanted to harken back to some of the things that Paul had mentioned. And that is, and this is very, very important, and that is the things that we learn through the response and the recovery efforts. And he showed a diagram that showed a feedback loop, strategy and emergency response continuum with a feedback loop back to the strategy formulation piece, is that we really need to learn from the response and recovery efforts and be able to then apply what we learn and what we think are best practices back into the strategy development component, so that we actually develop a new baseline. We develop improved mitigation and emergency preparedness efforts, so that the next time we actually face that kind of disaster, we're better prepared, and we have better mitigation strategies involved. So that feedback loop is really, really important. One thing that I will talk about in a couple more slides is now our new focus on defense critical energy infrastructure. But before I do that, I also want to talk about that another key concern are the vulnerabilities associated with infrastructure interdependencies. We know that we've got highly interdependent infrastructures, telecommunications, transportation, energy systems, et cetera. And so one of the questions we have there is how proactive should the federal government be? How should the the federal government actually work with states um, to be able to actually take a look at these vulnerabilities and be able to do something about them, be able to address them, because from a national security standpoint, the energy infrastructure is fundamental to supporting our way of life, our well-being. And so we have an effort that I'm going to talk briefly about called the North American Energy Resilience Model to actually look at interdependencies between these different infrastructures and where they might be vulnerable, and then to be able to provide the findings from that effort to state leaders. With respect to cybersecurity, which is a huge concern, Emma Stewart did a really, really good job yesterday, I think, of presenting the key considerations, what's being done around those key considerations, and to mention what sort of institutional processes in place there are to address cybersecurity concerns. Of course, that's a continuing effort, and we still need to evolve with respect to doing that. This talk that I want to give today of those four components that I talked to with respect to enhancing pre and post-disaster capabilities, I really want to focus on the mitigation aspect of it and what we can start to think about with respect to improving our mitigation capabilities and how that might lead to what a cogent investment strategy might be. Next slide, please. Thank you. Paul showed this slide. I'm just repeating it briefly, really to emphasize that there is interdependence among these critical infrastructures. And the interdependence goes in two different directions. We've got obviously the electricity infrastructure that supports all of these other infrastructures, transportation of oil, manufacturing of fuels, but also natural gas and transportation of natural gas, transportation itself, communications, water management, either supply or wastewater management, et cetera. And so electricity is a fundamental supporting capability to enable all these other infrastructures to work. But also these infrastructures are needed and support the ability of the electric system to work. So it actually goes in both directions, and we're really looking hard at again these interdependencies, but where we're really starting is to really look at how the electric infrastructure and the natural gas infrastructure are independent, and they're very interdependent, not only because they support each other, but we've got markets and other mechanisms that are highly coupled between these two different systems. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show this slide to be able to really talk about, present what we mean by defense critical energy infrastructure and what are the considerations around that. I understand, beginning to understand, because we work with a lot with the Department of Defense, that the defense facilities in the United States are really becoming increasingly targeted by state and non-state actors. Disabling a defense facility impacts significantly our defense and strike capabilities. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of the battle is on our homeland already. It's come ashore. And so protecting the defense facilities and their critical missions has become a major concern. Now, we know that defense facilities do not live in isolation, that they are dependent upon the surrounding communities in a very interdependent way. And they're dependent with respect to energy supply, electricity supply, water, telecommunications, transportation, etc. A power plant in the surrounding community may need to serve a defense facility, and during an emergency situation, that power plant may still need to provide power, electricity, etc., to that facility in times of an emergency. And so it's really important for us to start thinking about what kind of backup systems or what kind of systems we might put in place to ensure that the defense facility continues to get electricity from the surrounding community. There are communities in some states where we've got a lot of distributed energy resource adoption going on. And so because of the variability of distributed energy resources in the surrounding community, we may have to start thinking about what kind of flexibility and backup provisions we need in the surrounding community, again, to be able to maintain the critical functions of the defense facility that is within its footprint. So to ensure the operation of mission-critical defense functions, we certainly have to think about what the supporting critical infrastructure is within the surrounding community and how that could be adequately protected from all threats. But there's another dimension here, and that is that civilian and military populations supporting defense critical infrastructures, defense critical functions, reside within the surrounding community. So during an emergency, what kind of capabilities, what should we do to ensure that the civilian and military populations can function appropriately? I wanted to just mention one other thing with respect to this slide, and that is that deploying resilience measures can be done in a way to support both civilian and defense needs, but it will require a coordinated effort because depending upon the threat, the needed investments may require funding from both the feds and ratepayers as well. So we obviously, federal folks need to coordinate with state folks to be able to determine what the right investments are and where the money is going to come from. But also, another major point is that efforts should be integrated into local distribution planning processes. That is if we've got to undertake efforts that are in the surrounding community that support the defense facility as well as the surrounding community objectives, we certainly need to be able to incorporate that into our integrated planning processes. Thanks for the next slide.
That was the next slide. Thank you.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. So we're actually undertaking an effort, just to move on a little bit here, we're undertaking an effort to examine interdependencies between different infrastructures. And we have a very large modeling effort, and we're looking at, again, how these infrastructures are coupled, if there are threats, what kind of vulnerabilities we would see as a result of those threats, and how those threats may actually cascade from one system to another, and what the resulting consequences. We really want to be able to provide the findings from this modeling effort to decision makers so that we can collectively, in a coordinated sense, be able to develop mitigation strategies. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of the model that's being developed. It's called the North American Energy Resilience Model. You can see that there's going to be a component of it that will be looking at threats. We'll be looking at all the different interconnects, Eastern, Western, ERCOT interconnects, and as well as how the American grid connection with the Canadian-Mexico grid. But beyond just looking at what an electricity model would be, we wanted to be able to see how that model is interconnected with water, transportation, and telecommunications. And again, it's not just electricity, but it's also looking at natural gas and the oil manufacturing and pipeline infrastructure. So we're actually trying to develop a very large model that's trying to bring all of these infrastructure interdependencies together. There is a static model component that we're finishing up right now, and we want to be able to develop a dynamic model that looks at how all these systems interact in real time, and given specific threats, what are the vulnerabilities and how they're going to cascade. And again, one thing that we're trying to figure out right now, and hopefully with you and folks at NASIO and NARUC is given the findings that come out of this effort, what are the institutional processes that we need to put in place to be able to determine how to address the findings and be able to mitigate the vulnerabilities and their subsequent consequences. Next slide, please. So we've been working to develop what we call a resilience decision framework. Paul is involved with that, and others as well. And what we realized early on was that we have institutional processes in place already with regard to how we address or deal with energy efficiency, how we deal with reliability. We've got energy efficiency programs, regulators understand them, utilities understand them. There's a mutual understanding with regard to what the objectives of these programs are, how to implement them. We also have a similar institutional capability surrounding reliability. Joetta talked about reliability. We've got reliability metrics. When it comes to instituting processes to address energy efficiency and reliability, they're basically in place. We don't have the same kind of capability around resilience. And that's really what we're trying to get at. What is the institutional process? What's the decision-making process that we can begin to institute around resilience that leads to effective infrastructure investment decisions? So that is something that we are really trying to address. And of course, we're going to have to work with you, for other folks in states to be able to really articulate not only what the process is, but also what the roles and responsibilities are. The other point that I want to make around this is that we find that if we can develop a consistent understanding of what the processes are and what the respective roles and responsibilities are across the set of players that are involved in the decision-making process, that helps to sort of demystify how to actually begin to move forward in developing a resilience strategy. What this picture is trying to show us right here is that there are different players involved within making resilience decisions. Okay, I mean, obviously we've got governors' offices and their advisors, legislators, emergency response offices, state energy offices, public utility commissions, utilities. They're all involved in this effort to try to determine what resilience investment, what resilience practices should be put into place. Okay, and so, and if you take just a quick look at this picture, some of the major elements are, what are the policy goals and objectives? Okay, What kind of coordination do we need? What kind of risk mitigation strategies do we need to be able to put into place, right? But then once we begin to develop a set of objectives and where we want to head with respect to resilience, the Public Utility Commissions, the state energy offices really need to start setting real objectives and really have to start setting the requirements so that then utilities can actually undertake the analysis and develop their business practices and their technology deployment plans that then can affect true resilience strategy. And so we really are trying to articulate this. And again, given the national security concern, the question now is how do the feds actually get integrated into this process so that we can develop coherent strategies around implementing resilience decisions. So if indeed we're going to pursue trying to address some of the national security concerns, and if we're going to actually try to pursue also state and community concerns and bring all of that together, there is significant funding that's going to be required to do that, especially with respect to resilience mitigation. And I wanted to, we did some research to take a look at what programs were out there that could provide federal funding for mitigation activities. There are additional funds beyond that to help improve emergency preparedness and things like that. But this is a subset of federal programs where funding is available specifically for mitigation. And so FEMA has 4 major programs. One's the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and this program is provides funding to states after a disaster has occurred to protect public and private property through hazard mitigation efforts. There was a significant amount of funding provided in this program in 2018. There's a 75 to 25, there's a 75 to 25 ratio, Fed, non-Fed match ratio that's required with this, and there's a link to it. There's a pre-disaster mitigation grant program. This requires a community-adopted hazard mitigation plan and the determination of efforts to mitigate the impact of identified potential natural disasters. Again, there's money available that has been provided for that, $250 million in 2019. Again, there's another link. There's a flood mitigation assistance program. This provides funding for projects to reduce or eliminate the risk of repetitive flood damage to buildings that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. Again, there's funding available there. There's the link. And then there's a much larger program that is being developed. I don't think it's being deployed yet, but it's going through a comment period. And this is the Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities program. This was program is instituted as a result of a congressional act, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, and it will reserve 6% of total funding obligated yearly to the Disaster Relief Fund. That's the fund that's actually provided to states by FEMA annually when there is a disaster. And this program is meant to support the funding of new and large infrastructure projects. There's a very large amount of money that's being put aside annually. You can see $350, $500 million is what's being estimated. And again, this requires a 75 to 25 Fed to non-Fed match. So that's a very large program. And again, the HUD has a community development block grant program the mitigation component of it. And again, close to $7 billion is going to be made available to applicants recovering from disasters in 2015 to 2017 to carry out strategic and high impact activities to mitigate disaster risks and reduce future losses. And again, this is while considering a wide range of community development efforts. HUD typically helps low and disadvantaged communities, and there's a component of addressing that within this block grant program. There is, if you take a look at the website, there are a number of states that have gone through disasters this funding will be available to. That includes Florida, Texas, and other states in the Southeast. I don't have a full list, but these funds may be very, very relevant to you. I'm proposing to work closely with NASIO and NARUC. I know that both organizations are very much familiar with the FEMA programs and the HUD flood programs, but what potentially we should do is put together a package that provides details on each of these programs and perhaps some of the other programs, and then provide those to you. So that's an action item that we'll undertake and try to offer that package to you.
Hey, Joe, how would you like to go to questions here?
Yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation. Lots of resources. So first, just briefly on timeline, when do you think you'll have, DOE will be able to provide more information on first the static model, the North American Energy Resilience Model, and second, on the dynamic version of the model? Just asking time frame.
Right now, my understanding is the static model is completed. Okay, so, but whether findings are being made available, I'm not sure, and I can find that out. Okay, there's still a lot of effort that needs to be done on the dynamic model. Obviously, that's really much more complicated and very ambitious. I'll try to get some information back to you on that, but quite honestly, I don't see that happening for a while, and a while might mean, months to a year or something like that. Does that help? Are you on mute? Maybe you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Going back to the prior slide, could a state make the case that federal funds for resilience mitigation, let's say through FEMA or HUD, be used to make defense critical facilities more energy efficient and energy independent in order to make them more robust during resilience events?
Yeah. In fact, we would really like to leverage these funds as much as possible to be able to address the defense critical energy infrastructure concerns. And in fact, all of these funds are provided to state, local governments, communities, et cetera. And those communities, I took a look yesterday at who's eligible, and those communities can then provide funds as they see fit to private folks in their communities, including utilities. Under the HUD funding, again, states and communities, et cetera, can apply to those. But I think actually utilities can apply directly to those as well.
That's great. Thank you. I think a lot of states will be interested in exploring that. Let's go back to slide 4, Carrie. This was about the examples of how the surrounding community provides really important support for defense critical infrastructure. And Joe, you talked about, and so did Paul, the example of utility scale power plants providing electricity to defense facilities. Obviously, that's a big enchilada. But some utilities, like in my neck of the woods, Portland General Electric in Oregon, they've been operating dispatchable standby generation programs for a really long time. And under these programs, the utilities have agreements with military bases and other large customers that have really sizable on-site emergency generators. These are typically diesel-fired. The utility, in the case of Portland General, at least, installs control and communications hardware, maintains the generator, and it also pays for fuel and adding fuel storage. And in return, the utility has the right to dispatch these generators when the local region has a really critical need for power. But in all these cases, the generator is still directly powering that military base or other large customer whenever that generator is operating. So it's also maintaining resilience through the local distribution outages as well. So, since you really focus sort of on large-scale utility plants providing the electricity, is this kind of program, which is about distributed generation, is this another example of coordination with the surrounding community?
Yeah, Lisa, that's a great example. And what you're mentioning here and sort of illustrating is that a lot of these efforts to provide resilience, to provide greater backup and capabilities and flexibility really have served a lot of purposes, not only the community, but also the defense facility within the community. So that's a great example of what can be done. Again, getting back to some of the comments that Paul made and others, it's going to be, with respect to resilience, investments and practices and instituting those, it's going to be really important to take sort of a holistic look at what we can do to make the grid more resilient. And there is obviously some customers will want backup generation to serve them, but oftentimes we can take a look at some of these investments as serving a larger community and having a societal benefit. So again, an integrated planning process is going to have to consider what some of these larger benefits are, what some of the larger resilience benefits are, and they may all not lend themselves easily to a benefit to cost analysis. They may lend themselves more readily to trying to achieve a very specific societal objective that's conveyed by the state policymakers and other folks within the state or community.
Great, thanks, Joe. I think that's all the time we have for your presentation. Carrie, back to you.
Thank you.